Hello everyone, Mr. McTidge here. Ever since Muse's inception, how much they sound like Radiohead has been a contentious debate. On one side of the spectrum you have people who think Radiohead invented music and everything Muse has ever written wouldn't exist without them, and on the other side you have those who vehemently deny that Matt Bellamy and co. ever took the slightest notion of influence from the critically acclaimed quintet. From all the reviews and music journalism I've read, the average critical response to this debate seems to be that Muse played copycat in their first LP Showbiz, but the Radioheadiness of their music declined to just influence in their second and third LPs, Origin of Symmetry and Absolution. But there are still a number of people on forums and comment sections everywhere who take some extreme points of view on this topic, and so in this video I will be analysing exactly how much does Muse sound like Radiohead. In this analysis, I will be looking at each band's first 3 albums, as this is where people tend to make the comparisons between the two bands. I don't see anyone trying to make the argument that The Second Law sounds like Kid A. Before I get into the meat of the discussion, I would like to make my biases completely clear. I'm a huge fan of Radiohead's work and largely strong discography, but I'm also a fan of about half of Muse's work as well. I don't think this would incline me to think one way or the other, but I will do my best to be as fair and reasonable in this analysis as I can. I'll start off my analysis by looking at the compositional elements of both bands' work, i.e. their general use of rhythm, harmonies and texture. I've gone through each song on both of their first 3 albums and have assigned them broad categories based on these compositional elements in order for us to get a good overview of how they use these features in their music. I will see if I can provide a link to the spreadsheet I used to note these broad descriptors so that, if you want, you can see that I'm not cherry-picking examples for the sake of argument. So I'll start off with the Rhythms of Radiohead. There is something that is strikingly consistent throughout their work, and that is their use of syncopation. Syncopation being a note or chord being emphasised off the main beat. Starting from Stop Whispering from Pablo Honey, you can hear how the second half of each musical phrase has guitar chords coming in syncopated. Similarly, Prove Yourself uses syncopation in the same way. Radiohead often balance their use of syncopation with more straightly played rhythms, and this can be heard further in both the Bends and OK Computer with songs like Planet Telex, The Bends, Bones, Black Star, The Trickster, Exit Music, Karma Police, Electioneering and Climbing Up the Walls. It's clear that syncopation is a strong rhythmic component in a lot of Radiohead's compositions. However, when you listen to Muse's first 3 albums, syncopation is rarely a feature. In fact, in their first 2 albums there aren't any songs that use syncopation to any notable extent. On Absolution, however, there are a few tracks that use syncopation: Apocalypse Please, Sing for Absolution, Falling Away With You, and Endlessly. But with these tracks, syncopation is a constant feature either throughout the entire song or for the entire verse while switching the rhythms in the chorus, which, in terms of comparing it to the way Radiohead uses syncopation, can only really be compared to Exit Music, in which the syncopated guitar strums remain present for the bulk of the song. On the other hand, when you listen to Muse's material, the most rhythmically striking feature is their use of additive rhythms. For those who don't know, an additive rhythm is when emphasis on the beats is divided unevenly or irregularly. Take for example Sunburn from Muse's debut album Showbiz. If you split the 1-bar phrase down into 8 quavers and mark the quavers where the emphases lie, you can break down the bar into quaver groups of 1, 3, 3 and 1. And this makes a kind of additive rhythm. Similarly, take the main riff from Plug-in Baby and you can break this down into groups of 3, 4, 4, 2 and 3, another additive rhythm. Muse makes strong use of these kinds of rhythms and can be heard on songs like Bliss, Citizen Erased, Time Is Running Out, Stockholm Syndrome, Butterflies and Hurricanes, Thoughts of a Dying Atheist. Basically the list is very long. But when you try to find these kind of rhythms in Radiohead's music, they are very, very sparse. The only tracks I could find them in were Airbag, Letdown and Bulletproof I Wish I Was, all in which they use by far the most common additive rhythm in quavers being split into 3, 3, 2. And nothing remotely similar to the more complex additive rhythms that Muse employ. Other interesting uses of rhythm by both bands, such as the odd bar of 2-4 in You, or the passage of 7-8 in Paranoid Android by Radiohead, or the rhythmic displacement in Philip, or the morphing bar phraseology in Microcuts by Muse, aren't really techniques employed by the other bands respectively, but also aren't really representative of their rhythmic style either, so it's fair to conclude that both bands' use of rhythm is very, very different. Next up, I'd like to talk about harmonies and texture, which I will tackle together because I think in the case of Radiohead, these two elements are very interconnected in their first three albums. And you can hear how Radiohead evolved how they employ these compositional elements from Pablo Honey to OK Computer. The grunge style that Pablo Honey takes several of its cues from, in my opinion, rarely has interesting harmonic features, and in Pablo Honey, many of the chord progressions are rather standard, minor-sounding chord progressions. And similarly, the genre employs the most common broad-term texture in music, that being a homophonic texture. For those who don't know, homophonic textures can broadly be defined as having one melodic voice, often in the form of vocals, but could also be a guitar solo or melodic instrumental line, that goes over a backing that is usually defined as just being chords. And Pablo Honey follows this homophonic formula to a T. The Bends also follows homophonic textures throughout its runtime, but we do see an interesting development in the backing voice of the homophonic textures. This is most notable in songs like Nice Dream and Black Star. Particularly in the second verse of Nice Dream, you can hear how the acoustic guitars, strings and electric guitar all work together to form the backing. None of these instrumental voices diverge much with the established rhythmic or harmonic framework of the song, but all do their thing in a slightly different way to provide a richer backing to the piece. Similarly, the second verse on Black Star has all the guitars working around the same rhythmic and harmonic voice, but slightly differently to provide a richer homophonic texture. This technique of having the instruments only slightly diverge away from each other also provides much of the harmonic interest in the bends, resulting in a lot of added note chords, such as in Bulletproof I Wish I Was, High and Dry, and the bends, and also some lovely suspensions in Nice Dream. Without these rich chords, the bends would have probably been as harmonically bland as Pablo Honey, only with the exception of Just, which rather deliberately but brilliantly places seemingly unrelated chords next to each other in a way that sounds odd but also completely natural. Moving forward to OK Computer, and we hear the textural and harmonic developments made in the bends taken even further. Many critics praise OK Computer for its use of texture, comparing it to classical era music, and while I think the comparison is a little shallow, it does have some merit. The more rich homophony I described in songs like Nice Dream and Black Star in the Bends are pushed even further in some of the tracks on OK Computer into what I would describe as elaborate homophony. Songs like Airbag and No Surprises never stray far from having one dominant melodic line, and the backing is never straying too far from its harmonic or rhythmic anchor. But the backing does its best to fill up the soundscape with flourishes and nuance suitable for the tone of the song, and melodies are sometimes doubled harmonically by the instrumentation. Subterranean Homesick Alien, I would argue, sees the most satisfying use of this elaborate homophony, which can be heard from the first chorus onwards as the gorgeously spacey yet pastoral keys and guitar weave around each other, and Greenwood's guitar touches on the counter-melodic. The harmonies in OK Computer thus continue to make infrequent use of added note chords and suspensions, but among all this there's more harmonic variety on OK Computer as well compared to Radiohead's previous efforts. Most notable is that Radiohead's use of chord substitutions are much more confident here and can be heard on songs like Subterranean Homesick Alien, Exit Music, and No Surprises. There are other interesting harmonic elements on this album as well, such as the dissonance on Fitter Happier, the whole tone scales used on Paranoid Android, and the chromatic chords in Karma Police, but they tend to be one-off flavourings rather than a stylistic standard for Radiohead. For Muse's music, Showbiz uses very standard natural minor rock chord progressions for most of its runtime and can be very much compared to the standard of harmony in Pablo Honey. But it's a much different story when you get to Origin of Symmetry and Absolution. The use of a strong harmonic minor key is everywhere in these two albums. It would be quicker for me to list the few songs that don't use it, and it's a key that is rarely used by Radiohead. Furthermore, while Radiohead rarely shifts harmonic features within songs, in Origin of Symmetry and Absolution, Muse makes strong use of vibrant tonal changes in their music. Bliss, Screenager, and Falling Away With You shift between tonic, major and minor chord sequences between verses and chorus. Songs like Stockholm Syndrome and Citizen Erased use Ionian modal inflections in their harmonic minor choruses, and in songs like Space Dementia and Butterflies and Hurricanes. Muse employ much more luxuriantly dark, romantic harmonies that sound like they could have been taken out of Rachmaninoff's guide to writing seductive piano pieces. All in all, Muse's approach to harmony is much more about tonal variety and vibrancy, whereas Radiohead usually stands in one harmonic lane to give their songs a cogent tone for the duration of any given song. It's important to note here that while Radiohead is a 5-piece band, Muse is a 3-piece, and so building complex added note chords within the texture of a song like Radiohead does on the Benz and OK Computer simply isn't likely to be the direction of harmony that Muse will take in their music when they try at best to keep their music on their 3 instruments plus maybe one extra instrumental line. This leads on into comparing the textures between the two bands, and things get a little more interesting. When you look at Showbiz, the type of homophonic texture that's standard in rock that you see in Pablo Honey is present here, and you can see it in songs like Showbiz, Cave, Escape, etc. But there are also tastes of more complex homophony on a somewhat similar level to the Benz in songs like Muscle Museum and Uno, and so on Showbiz you can hear how there are influences of textures that Radiohead developed in their first 2 albums. However, when you move on to Origin of Symmetry, the textures that you hear are nothing like Radiohead have done. Here the textures are much more polyphonic and contrapuntal, and the effect it produces can be starkly contrasted with Radiohead's music. Take for example the song Bliss. If you listen to the verses, you have arpeggiated synths flying up and down in quick, straight semiquavers, and the sound is visceral and exhilarating. Beneath that, you have a bass that strides along with an off-kilter anger as it alternates playing straight quavers with an additive rhythm. The vocal melody is even slower and has a slightly mournful tone to it, and so combined together we have this rhythmically and texturally complex contrapuntal piece of music that balances different emotions within its auditory framework. These more polyphonic textures can be found throughout Muse's work on Origin of Symmetry in songs like Newborn, Space Dementia, Hypermusic, Plug-in Baby, Screenager and Darkshines, as well as some songs in Absolution like Hysteria, Butterflies and Hurricanes and Stockholm Syndrome. This use of having different rhythmic and melodic lines embedded within the music is very characteristic of Muse's work, and it's what helps create this sense of chaos and urgency within their music. So to summarise their use of texture, Radiohead's homophony provides a cogent, emotionally unilateral and naturally satisfying feeling to their material, while Muse's polyphony helps create a sense of pandemonium and a degree of emotional complexity within their music. So looking at their compositional similarities and differences, the only point at which Muse resembles anything close to Radiohead is in their debut album Showbiz, but I think it would be incorrect to end my analysis there, as the tones of the instruments is something that's most commonly cited as a point of similarity between the two bands. So I'm going to look a little further into some of the more timbral similarities that get pointed out. One key sound of Muse is their strong use of distorted bass from Origin of Symmetry onwards, and many Radiohead fans refer this back to the ending of Radiohead's song Exit Music, where the chilling, softer sounds are replaced by eerie guitar and this powerful, gritty, distorted bassline that thrusts the song into the stratospheric for a fleeting minute. Some Radiohead fans then like to claim that Muse owe this sound to Radiohead, but it only takes a Google search to find that fuzz bass has been used since at least 1961, when it was used on a solo in Marty Robbins' song Don't Worry. Indeed, the Wikipedia page on fuzz bass lists a plethora of songs that have used this style before Radiohead did in Exit Music. Some of my favourites being Apostrophe by Frank Zappa and the climax of King Crimson's Starless. Definitely check those two songs out. This is why my statement at the beginning of the video that some people think Radiohead invented music was less than entirely flippant. There's no doubt there's a similarity between the use of bass in Muse's work and the use of bass in Exit Music, but it isn't a tone of Radiohead's invention, nor is it one that they established as something to be commonplace within their genre, let alone their own sound, even if they did make fantastic use of it. So while I think it's a brief stylistic similarity, it's also a non sequitur to say that it's something that Muse had taken from Radiohead. There is, however, a tone I think Muse did take from Radiohead. In songs like Creep, Stop Whispering, and Anyone Can Play Guitar, Jonny Greenwood uses this distinctive streaming guitar sound made by combining distortion with a tremolo technique, often used to add a layer of intensity to a climax. This technique can be found in a number of Muse songs across their first 3 albums in Sunburn, Showbiz, Uno, Plug-in Baby, and Blackout. And so I do think this is one aspect of Radiohead influence that has lasted across Muse's first 3 albums. The last Timbre comparison that people tend to make is the one that, as a music lover and enthusiast, has my face firmly wedged in the palm of my hand. And that's the comparison that Muse's Matt Bellamy's vocal style is taken from Radiohead's Tom York, and there are a number of reasons why I find this comparison to be asinine. Essentially, the similarity boils down to that they both sing high-pitched at times, but every single nuance in the way that they sing is completely different. York's vocal melodies tend to be syncopated, and he often sings slightly behind or ahead of the rhythm at times as well, which can be heard on the choruses of Letdown or on No Surprises, whereas Bellamy tends to sing in a variety of rhythms. When York sings high-pitched, he tends to only go into his softer head voice range, whereas Bellamy frequently employs a more striking falsetto to help aid the climax of his songs. And I also go back to the point I made about people saying that Radiohead invented music, because there are 2 words that completely blow the argument that Matt Bellamy took York's vocal style completely out of the water. Those 2 words being Jeff Buckley. Jeff Buckley is probably my favourite vocalist of all time, and his amazing use of both head voice and falsetto in his only LP Grace brings his songs the most amazing amount of emotion and life. It's as clear as day that in vocal styles, Bellamy and York are both taking strong cues from Buckley, and both are on record stating him as an influence. If anything, they each take from the 2 different sides of what Buckley's vocals afforded to his music. So when people say that Bellamy imitates York's vocal style, it's just another fallacious assertion. So to answer the question, how much does Muse sound like Radiohead? I think the answer I estimated to be the average that people would give is fairly accurate. Muse's first album, Showbiz, shows a strong similarity to Radiohead's music, particularly Radiohead's first 2 LPs. But after that, the amount Muse takes from Radiohead's sound drops quickly into what I would call, for lack of a better term, a normal amount of influence. Or certainly at least not more influenced by Radiohead than, say, Rachmaninoff, Rage Against the Machine, Queen, or Tool. This then leaves the question of why do we get so many people on one end of the spectrum saying Muse owes everything they've ever written exclusively to Radiohead, and those who say Muse didn't even touch Radiohead's sound? The answer to the latter I think is quite easy, but rests on the more complicated hypothesis I've developed to answer the former. OK Computer is an incredibly critically acclaimed album. Any review from any serious publication has spoken of it incredibly highly, and it has received perfect scores, if not near perfect scores, across the board. I don't think there's another album that has had the same amount of critical acclaim in the last 50 years except maybe Abbey Road, and as justified as I think a lot of this acclaim is, it's had an interesting side effect. If everyone can broadly speaking agree that it's an exceptional album, then rarely will anyone bat any eyelashes when some critics and commenters make a few hyperbolized statements about the album. I'm not talking about quality here, as that's always going to be an element of individual taste, but more about the album's originality and experimentation, which I have seen exaggerated quite a lot. The track that can really be described as genuinely innovative on OK Computer is Fitter, Happier, which has a computer-generated voice delivering a spoken word poem over the top of dissonant piano and eerie electronic sounds. Other than that, there really isn't anything on OK Computer that hasn't been covered by decades of progressive and alternative rock before it. But the album itself felt like a breath of fresh air after a lot of the things it does well fell out of fashion in the 80s and early 90s. So these accepted hyperbolized statements then form the zeitgeist around OK Computer, and this zeitgeist can often be more important or valued when discussing the album than the album itself. And so to some, OK Computer being treated like a bastion of pure music divinity becomes more important than discussing it as an album with subjective merits like any other, and it forms an expected narrative on how all conversation about this album should be. And so when another alternative rock group comes along and experiments with alt-rock just as creatively as Radiohead did with OK Computer, if not more so, then those who hold the narrative around OK Computer and the album itself dear could very well feel the need to protect that narrative by attacking this oncoming artist by making some unfounded and or ridiculous claims of thievery, instead of making an argument as to why they think their work doesn't work as successfully or is as creative as Radiohead's. And you may think I'm speaking a bunch of waffle here, but it makes sense with what I've observed. Jeff Buckley didn't release Grace so long before Radiohead's work that the common influence between Muse and Radiohead isn't obviously clear, and while there are certain people who like to pretend that progressive rock didn't exist before Radiohead, I am an avid lover of the genre, and so I'm always going to be here to remind you. Therefore, it's only natural when Radiohead cultists make tenuous ethical claims that Muse stole Radiohead's entire sonic footprint that the other side would want to counter this quite libelous claim by making the just as ridiculous counter-assertion that Radiohead had no influence whatsoever on Muse's entire discography. So there you go, my analysis on one of the most contentious debates in alternative rock history. If you agree or disagree, please let me know in the comments below, and also let me know if you think there's anything salient in this discussion that I've missed and needs to be addressed. Honestly, I would love anyone to do that because I will take any chance I get to discuss some of my favourite bands. I hope you've enjoyed this video, maybe learned a thing or two. If you like this kind of content, then make sure to subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.